Welcome back to Hold Fast, where we have biblical truths for daily battles. My name is Kenny. I am the host of the podcast, and I want to start by saying I apologize, first of all, because if you are a regular listener to the podcast, you know that it's been a few weeks, and I posted on Facebook, if you saw, that I wanted to make it worth your while when I came back, and so I didn't come back alone. I decided to bring the best person that I possibly know to bring on the podcast. That is my wife, Jenna. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Look at that. So nice. So we are going to address a topic that may be difficult in some ways to address, not necessarily because it's hard to talk about, but because it is a hot topic in some ways, especially even in Christian circles. It's been a hot topic for a long time, ever since I remember, even in youth group growing up, and probably even long before that. This is something that has been talked about for a long time and recently has kind of risen back up as a topic of conversation that I've heard other people talking about. That is modesty. What is the biblical concept of modesty? What are we talking about when we ask people to become modest? And I really thought that Jenna was the best person to bring on the podcast because when we first met and began to spend just a little bit of time together in friend groups, really even the first night I met her, one of the most attractive things about her to me was her modesty, and not just, and we'll get into this in the podcast, not just her modesty in dress, but her modesty of spirit and the way that she carried herself has always been one of my favorite qualities of hers, which there are many. And so it stuck out to me, and she has always had a lot of wisdom in this area. So I wanted to bring her on to share. And so I'm going to do just that by kind of setting up the conversation and letting her share with you why is this important to you? What's your history with modesty? Maybe let's start there with, like, what's your own story and journey with how you have viewed modesty over the years? Because that's something we all have to learn growing up. We all have a moment where we realize this is a thing. And so what was that moment for you?
Well, two kind of words for introing, so thank you. I think it's helpful to start the conversation just with sharing a little bit of background. So I was raised in a Christian household, and I have a very vivid memory of when I was first introduced to this concept and idea of modesty, and that was around third grade. I grew up in a divorced home, and so there were some weekends that I was with my dad, and then other weekends I would be with my mom. And so on this particular weekend, I was with my dad, and he took me shopping to Old Navy. And I remember picking out some clothes and taking them home at the end of the weekend and showing them to my mom. And in the best Jenny Crow accent I can do, she looked at me and said, absolutely not. You are not allowed to wear that out of the house. And I remember at first, initially, I was pretty upset because for all intents and purposes, they were cute shorts, they were trendy. But then it was in that moment that I realized and was discipled on the fact of, since we are a Christian home, there is a standard of how you are to dress, how you are to present yourself. And so it was in that moment that the idea of modesty, if you will, was initially introduced to me. But then that view has shifted as I've gone into my adulthood years, in just that for me, now modesty is not just purely the external and the physical, but modesty truly starts inwardly and at the heart level of things, and is a spiritual issue, which then fleshes itself out in the physical. And so that's just something that I've been processing through in my adulthood years, and something that I've just thought about in a different way than I did initially as a kid, and even in the purity culture, if you will, growing up in the Christian home. So
Yeah, I think that's good because, and that's a snapshot. Obviously, there's a lot of details in there that you could go into, I'm sure, of how you got to that point in your story and your life of understanding what modesty is. But I think maybe it's helpful then for us to go to a passage that both of us would reference. Matter of fact, this is a Bible passage that is on our daughter's wall in her room, because this is really a central passage for understanding modesty in a lot of ways. Now, the biblical principle is throughout the Bible, I would say, in many different areas, but this is where it's really plainly given. And Peter is talking to women in this section, but we'll get into maybe this later, the fact that the conversation of modesty is not just for women. I think it's important to say that, but Peter is talking to women here when he says in 1 Peter chapter 3, "Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry, or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious." Now, it seems obvious to me that what Peter is saying is the important thing here is not necessarily what you wear. So don't focus so much on the adorning of the externals, but focus on your heart. And that's what you were saying. You're saying that you began to realize that modesty has to start from the heart. It has to start inwardly and then flesh itself out outwardly. Mm-hmm. So I guess the question, and there's a lot of questions that we can bring up here. If that's true, if modesty is really ultimately about what goes on inwardly, does it matter at all what you wear then?
Absolutely.
And we kind of had this conversation before we started recording, because my wife, what I love about my wife is she's always just very, like, she's not going to hold punches. She's not going to want to just kind of placate the issue. She's just going to be direct about it. And it matters what we wear outwardly. And Peter is kind of saying that, right? He's saying, don't focus on the adorning of the externals, because you should not be trying to get attention through the externals.
So I think a lot of people tend to look at modesty as legalistic, because it's something that a lot of people within our culture look at and say, well, this is just purely a physical thing. You're telling me that these are your Christian rules that you have, that I have to dress a certain way. This is filled with legalism, if you will. But underneath it all, if you truly are living with a heart that's been renewed by Christ and with a heart that desires to live out the gospel, that's going to affect the way that you present yourself. It's going to affect the way that you carry yourself. It's going to affect the way that you conversate with people. It's going to affect the way that you dress. All of it is going to be changed and renewed into the image of Christ. And so that's what I think the message that we're trying to go against the culture with is that, yes, what you are seeing is a physical thing, but ultimately it is an internal thing first and foremost.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And maybe it's helpful here to kind of, we're giving our position a little bit and talking about here's how we view modesty, but it's maybe helpful to hear there's extreme views in our culture. There's one side that says there is the legalistic side, right? That absolutely does say it's all about the specific clothing that you wear, right? So we both grew up in contexts where there would be dress code rules that said, girls' shorts must be fingertip length and boys can't go to the pool with their shirts off. And
but can we just talk about the culottes that we used to have to wear at Trinity back in the day?
The what? I don't know what you're talking about right now.
They're called culottes. This is going to show my age and time maybe a little bit.
Yes, because
culottes,
you are
people.
so very old right now,
Trinity Christian Academy with culottes.
Apparently, I am not in with that. I'm going to find out what they are later.
I think if I understand it correctly, it essentially was kind of like a skirt, if you will, where it had shorts and then it had like the skirt piece over it, but they were like extremely, extremely long. Anyways.
That's like the only time that word's ever going to be used in my podcast, by the way.
The dress code that we grew up with.
So there is that mentality that, and I'm not saying it's wrong, it's legalistic to have a dress code, by the way, but no. there are people who view that in a legalistic way. And then there's other people, and by the way, I think it's important to say, a lot of times in the legalistic view, there's very little concern about the heart, and there's all concern about the externals, okay? And then on the other side, actually in some similarities to it, they're so concerned with, well, it should only matter what goes on in my heart, and it doesn't matter what I wear. Mm-hmm. Like, and I would say that I'm primarily talking about people who would claim to be Christians here. Obviously, our culture doesn't think any of this really matters ultimately, but Christians would say, well, it doesn't matter what I wear with my clothing and all that, because everybody should be able to control themselves. Boys should be able to control their thoughts. Girls should be able to control their thoughts. And I should wear what I want. And it just matters what's going on in my heart. Those are the two extreme views. And we're coming in and we're saying, neither of those are really the biblical picture. The biblical picture is that it primarily matters what goes on in your heart, and then what happens within your heart when you're transformed by the gospel and an understanding of what a modest spirit is, that's going to flesh itself out in many ways, one of them being the way that you dress. Is that right? Would you agree with that?
I agree.
Yeah. Okay. So my wife agrees. I'm good to go with that. So, but let me flesh that out a little bit more. How would you respond to somebody who comes to you and says, Jenna, I just think you're just a little bit too concerned with the things that you wear. I really should be able to wear certain things that I want. And I'm not going to get extreme. Like, I'm not going to show up, literally like naked somewhere, but like, you're just being a little bit too extreme. Why does it matter what I wear? Why can't I just focus on the heart and just forget about the externals?
Well, I think you have to ask yourself kind of, again, the heart issue behind it of, well, why am I wanting to dress immodestly? Ultimately, it comes down to there's something deeper going on there that you need to kind of do a heart check, if you will, of, okay, I'm wanting to wear this certain style of clothing. Why? What's the motivation behind it? Am I doing it just to get attention? Am I doing it because I think it looks good? Am I doing it because, I'll fit in and be more trendy with my friends? Or am I doing it in a way that I am reflecting the image of Christ and reflecting obedience to him because of your heart being renewed and transformed?
Yep. Well, so let me ask.
So that's why it matters, if you make
Yes.
sense. So your question to me was, why does it matter? Why can't I just wear what I want to wear? And why is it a problem? Well, it matters because ultimately, there's deeper things going on, and you need to be in tune with that and aware of what's going on.
Yep. So maybe somebody would respond to that and they would say, well, Jenna, it's not that I'm trying to fit in with the culture. It's not that I'm trying to do any of what you said. It's just really hot outside. So that might sound like a really trivial thing, but I have heard that. Like, how do you respond when somebody says, listen, I'm dressing half naked because it's really hot outside and nobody should tell me that I need to wear clothing that's uncomfortable in order to have this standard of modesty? So how would you respond to that argument?
I would say that in order for you to be modest, you don't have to be hot per se, and we're speaking in terms of like heat hot.
Yeah.
But I just think, as with everything, like, you can always come up with a million excuses of like, well, there's this scenario and there's this reason why, I shouldn't have to present myself in this way. But at the end of the day, again, I know we've been saying this a lot, but it really is true. Like, it comes down to, it is a heart issue. And so, if you're out at the beach, like, you can still be modest and not be killing yourself in sweat.
Yep.
So, I mean, it is possible. It's just a matter of, are you willing to continually work for it and continually think about it in terms of your wardrobe and how you're presenting yourself?
Yeah, I mean, almost every argument that comes about modesty, it's always going to go back to the heart for me. So let me maybe give a little bit of my story on this as a youth pastor for many years and taking youth trips or doing youth events and setting certain standards. Almost every single time I did that, I had somebody who was upset about the standard. And almost every time I did that, I had somebody who wanted to buck up against the standard. And they always had a very similar approach to it. Was like, why does it matter what I wear? You can't tell me what to wear. Why are you so focused on this? And my conversation, which I always would try to have that, especially if it was a teenage girl that was talking to me about that, I want to have that conversation with my wife present, but we would always kind of point them to what's really important here is what's your heart behind it, and why are you so set on wanting to wear these clothes? Like, why does that matter to you? We're not trying to be legalistic. We're trying to pursue holiness and purity here, and that's a really important concept. So this begins to maybe translate into another argument that sometimes comes up because, again, maybe let me say this here because I said we would go here. This conversation matters for men too. So let's acknowledge the fact that it's not just women who are sometimes struggling with modesty. Men struggle with this all the time. I am more and more seeing I'll use this is one example. It's not the only example. More and more seeing men who go to the gym and they have their shirts off and they're flaunting their bodies in such a way, and they're not acting with modesty. Men are not acting with modesty when they're trying to display their masculinity for all to see and for everybody to be attracted to them, whether it's a sexual attraction or not. Like, that's immodest, in the same way that for women it's immodest to dress in a way and carry themselves in a way that's seeking to get attention. So how do we respond to, because there's a big argument here in our world, and this relates not just to the conversation of modesty, it relates to the conversation of sexual purity in general. But how do we respond to somebody who says, look, we should be able to wear what we want, and those men and women just need to keep their eyes to themselves. I'm not responsible for the impure thoughts of other people, so that should not have any bearing on what I wear. Is that a biblical mindset to have, and how do we respond to that argument?
No, it's not a biblical mindset to have.
I told you, no
to
nonsense.
Answer your question bluntly. I mean, it's kind of the same concept as thinking about the issue of like alcohol. If I know that somebody is struggling with alcohol, alcoholic, whatever, I'm not going to partake in front of them. And I think the same can be said with the whole modesty issue, is that ultimately there is a responsibility on you, and your responsibility is you dress yourself modestly, you check your heart and making sure that it's in line with the Word of God and with obeying Him and pleasing Him. And so our culture is so quick to using that line of not wanting to be responsible and have responsibility, but at some point you have to have responsibility and be accountable for your actions. And so,
and I would add to that, I think that's good, and I would add to that, there is truth that I'm not responsible for the thoughts of somebody else, right? Like, let's be clear about that. We're not saying that I am responsible for how somebody is stumbling necessarily. But Christian love says, if I know that the way that I'm carrying myself, the way that I'm going to dress, this action that I'm taking is going to cause somebody else to stumble, or if I know that it has the possibility to cause somebody else to stumble, I'm going to be loving in my approach, and I'm not going to do that thing, even if I have liberty to do that thing, right? So even if even if the way that I'm dressing is not in and of itself immodest, but I know that I could be in a context or a situation where maybe that would cause somebody else to stumble, then the loving thing to do is just don't wear that.
Yeah, just don't do it.
So that, I think it's a good kind of segue a little bit then into, all right, so how do we draw standards here? Like, how do we say that some set of clothing is modest and some is immodest? Is there just some like line that you draw? Like, let's go back to the days of, Christian schools and all this stuff. Like, do we do that? Like, how do we then think about what's modest and what's immodest? Maybe share a little bit about how do you think about that when you're buying clothes and when you're deciding what you're going to wear, and how do you think about what's the line and what is modest versus immodest?
So I think it's helpful to answer that with, there's this misconception, I think, among the culture that says, in order to be modest, I have to just find the most dinky, thrown away, just worn out looking thing. Just as long as I'm covered, I'm good. But, actually, I think that you can dress yourself in a way that displays your beauty, but is not attention seeking, if you will. And so I think it's important to note that you can be modest and still wear things that are flattering and things that still display your beauty, but just not in this attention seeking or even like provocative sexualized way. And so that's the difference.
And you can't draw a line and say this set of clothing is modest, this set of clothing is immodest, because the reality is on different people, certain clothes are going to be different too. So, I mean, that's a whole part of the conversation. But it's not helpful for us to get into specifics. It's not helpful for us to say, wear this, don't wear that, because it doesn't apply to everybody, first of all. And that does begin to get into the legalistic mindset. Like, I don't understand why it's not enough for people to just look at them and say, if you're seeking to truly have modesty of spirit, then dress in a way that reflects that. Like, I really, and I'm not trying to be, condescending in this, but I really don't understand why that's not enough for people. Like, and I think for some, not everybody, but for some, it's because they're really trying to hold on to wanting to appeal to the culture, wanting to get attention, wanting to just be a rebel against the system of religion or whatever it may be. There's all kind of reasons that people might have, but for me, it's so simple. And this is what I'm going to say to Lily. I mean, as she grows up, what I'm going to say to her is, this modesty of spirit is supposed to flesh itself out in the way that you dress, and sometimes I hope that I remember to ask the question, like, you want to wear that, you want to buy that item of clothing, do you think that reflects your modesty of spirit? Right? Like, and begin to get her to think about that. Now, I'm sure when she's a teenager, she's going to say, sure, it does.
Or I just flat out don't care.
Or I don't care. And that's when you just lock her in her room and you say you can't come out until, no, I'm just kidding. I'm totally kidding. But yeah, I think it's so simple, but yet we've complicated it, and our culture has,
And it does. It starts at a very young age. Unfortunately, our culture sexualizes things. And so you even see that among the clothing for children. And I've noticed as a mom, like, there's certain bathing suits that I will not buy for Lily, even at this age. She's only 4. But I want it to be very clear from her from a very young age that this is something that we take seriously, that we're passionate about. And again, it's not just solely a physical thing. It is an internal thing that is fleshed out within the physical. And so the goal for her is that her heart is renewed, that it's transformed, and that hopefully one day she is discipled in that growing up, and that it's not just a one conversation and done, but it's something that, over the course of her life, she can look back on and know that time and time again, we pointed her to the truth.
And she saw it exemplified in your life. Like, I mean, this is something that you might not want me to even say this, but like, people compliment you all the time on the clothes that you wear and the way that you dress and carry yourself, because first of all, you're beautiful, but second of all, because you do this the right way. And Lily is going to see and watch her mother exemplify what modesty looks like, not just from a clothing perspective, but also obviously from the inward perspective. And so that's how we want to train our kids. And if that's how I want to train my kid, then that's how I want to think about it too. And that's how I want everybody to think about it. That's an important concept to get. So I think this is helpful. There's a lot of ways and directions that we can go with this.
You could go with.
But I think this is a good conversation and maybe a good place to wrap it up. I mean, do you have any final thoughts on modesty that you want to share?
No, I mean, just very sweet. Husband got brownie points for complimenting me and just being so sweet.
I'm not supposed to do any more podcasts with her because I get emotional sometimes on these things.
He's getting emotional on me, getting teary-eyed.
No, because it matters. It matters not just for like our family, but men, it matters for the witness of the gospel. Because if we can carry ourselves, men and women, in a way with gentle spirits, in a way that's not attention seeking, in a way that's not trying to bring all eyes on us, in a way that's not seeking to cause other people to stumble, but yet we can still live joy-filled lives and be full of peace and hope. I think the culture takes notice of that. And men, what a testimony that can be. We can be made fun of for it, and people might not understand it, but I believe it's a beautiful testimony to the gospel to live in that way. So I think that's a good place to end. I don't know if I will ever convince Jenna to come back on the podcast with me or not, but I know that it's helpful to hear her perspective, and I hope that's true for you too. So thank you for joining me and being a part of it.
Well, thanks for having me. Thanks for sticking with me.
If this is helpful to you, share it. If you got questions and you want us to expound on some other stuff, feel free to shoot those questions my way. You can message me on Facebook. You can, if you have my number, text me, or you can email me at kennyroberts@missionwaychurch.org, not .com, .org, kennyroberts@missionwaychurch.org. I can't promise you I'll be able to convince Jenna to come back on to answer your questions, but because she doesn't want the spotlight on her. But I can promise you that I, Lord willing, will be back to be able to answer some of those if you have them. Like it, share it, comment. That helps other people see the episode as well. But thanks for listening to another episode of Hold Fast. I'll be back, Lord willing, next week with another episode. God bless.